and sit down.
Hello, Champagne Dreamers, and welcome back to another fabulous episode of Janessa After Dark. I am your hostess, Miss Janessa J. Champagne, but you can call me Miss J. And I am so excited for our guest today. I have an interview with a fabulous podcaster, author, and activist. We had a really fun conversation that happened pretty much at the spur of the moment. I was actually scheduled to record my interview with episode 5 guest Jerry LaRue, and he had something come up and had to cancel, and at the last minute she filled in so that I'd still have something to record that evening. So even though I wasn't as prepared as I normally like to be for my interviews, we still had a great conversation, and I think you're really going to get to enjoy meeting her. But before we get to her interview, I want to start by talking a little bit about a word that some of you listening may not be familiar with, and that word is cisgender. Now, I'm about to be real classy, and I'm going to read you the Wikipedia definition of the word cisgender. Cisgender, often abbreviated to simply cis, is a term for people whose gender identity matches the sex that they were assigned at birth. Cisgender may also be defined as those who have a gender identity or perform a gender role society considers appropriate for one's sex. It is the opposite of the term transgender. Now, I don't remember when I first heard the term cisgender, but I know it was around the time that I discovered Julia Serrano's book Whipping Girl, a transsexual woman on sexism and the scapegoating of femininity. Now, when I first discovered that term, I was actually pretty excited about it, because up until that point, every other description of gender that wasn't traditionally male or traditionally female was put up against some sort of standardized normal. By having a term like cisgender, it recognizes that being traditionally male or traditionally female isn't normal so much as it is common, and it doesn't otherize or marginalize other expressions of gender identity and experience. And on a macro level, when we're talking about populations and when we're talking about our society as a whole, I think that the term is still really, really useful. I think that when we have something that is common and we treat it like it is normal, that creates problems for people who don't subscribe to that identity. If this one thing is considered quote unquote normal, then everything else by extension must be abnormal. And so changing the nomenclature and including a word like cisgender to recognize a very specific and very common type of gender identity and expression does so without marginalizing the other expressions and identities that are out there. But while I think that this macro level description is still very useful and very vital and necessary, I have some problems with how it's being used in our culture, and especially within our own queer communities. As trans issues and activism have become much more prominent in our culture, the discussion around gender identity and expression and performance is becoming much more nuanced and I think interesting. And that's a great thing, but it also has led to some natural conflicts arising as people start to talk about who gets to own different types of identities and who is in some ways even allowed to speak about gender identity. Now, I'm a part of this conversation in a couple of different ways. First of all, obviously I'm a drag queen, and the performance of drag, the art of drag, is built around encountering and playing with and exaggerating gender in a variety of different ways. Just like there are lots of different types and styles of drag, there are also a wide range of identities and descriptions that the drag performers themselves use to describe their experience of gender. There is no one size fits all. Just because somebody performs in drag doesn't mean that out of drag, they are necessarily cisgender. For some people, the drag that they do helps them explore and helps them discover things about their gender identity. And for some people, it's just a type of theater. It's just a performance that they take part in. And all of those experiences are entirely valid. But what happens is that often people assume that if you are a drag performer, then when you are out of drag, when you are off stage, you are cisgender. This not only erases all of the fabulous trans people who are also drag performers and whose performance may or may not be part of how they craft their identity offstage, it also erases the fact that there are many drag performers, myself included, who wash off the makeup and take off the costume and step into a gender identity that is much more complicated and much more turbulent than the nice, easy package that cisgender describes. And that leads to the second way that I approach this question of gender identity. I have a long, complicated gender journey that I've been on for pretty much my entire life. When I was a kid, I was never particularly good at performing what was expected of me as my gender. I loved all kinds of toys. I loved toys that were supposed to be for boys, toys that were supposed to be for girls. I didn't care. If you wanted to give me a toy, I was going to take it. But I especially loved more feminine toys. I loved Barbie dolls and I loved My Little Ponies. Even with things like G.I. Joe or He-Man, I was always very drawn to the limited selection of female figures that appeared in those toy lines. When it came to Saturday morning cartoons, I always identified more with the female characters on the screen. When I watched Scooby-Doo or when we played Scooby-Doo, I always wanted to be Daphne. Now, part of that had to do with the fact that Daphne always got to go with Fred when everyone would split up. And now that I'm a little bit older, if I had to pick somebody on that show to be, I would much rather be Velma. That bitch had some shit figured out. But I've always had a piece of my own personal spirit, a piece of myself that has been very strongly identified with traditional femininity, and in some ways the more exaggerated portrayals of that femininity. Velma on Scooby-Doo is feminine, but Daphne is ultra feminine. She's the prettiest. She's the most curvaceous. While Velma relies on her brains, Daphne is there to be beautiful. It's not that she doesn't contribute to the team, but she's meant to be interpreted as having this advantage over Velma because of how she looks. The same thing with Gilligan's Island. There were 3 female characters on that show, but the one that I identified with was Ginger. Marianne was sweet, a nice hokey farm girl. Mrs. Howe was sort of silly and ridiculous, but Ginger was sexy. She was feminine. She was desirable. And here, my understanding of gender is tied up in my understanding of sexuality. Because even as a kid, I knew that I wanted people like the professor and people like Gilligan and people like the skipper looking at me the way that they looked at Ginger. I wanted to be desired. And so my association with femininity was related to a very specific type of femininity that was meant to elicit a reaction from men. Now, as I got older and my gender identity continued to evolve, my understanding and appreciation of femininity became less about the desires and the gaze of a man and more about appreciating femininity in and of itself. It was about recognizing and honoring the softness and the sweetness that I found within myself. Things that I had been told over and over again that I should suppress, that I wasn't supposed to feel or wasn't supposed to behave that way because of what I was assigned at birth. It was also an opportunity for me to look back at the strong women in my life and recognize that there was more to femininity. There was more to that piece than just being desirable. It meant being strong and fiercely loyal like my single mother, who left a marriage to an alcoholic man and raised 2 children on her own. It was about being resourceful and taking care of the people and things around you like my grandmother, who was a farm wife for more than 50 years. It was understanding that those stories, those experiences that I was immersed in growing up are just as much a part of femininity as sequins and rhinestone jewelry. And when I was building my drag persona, I wanted to make sure that I was creating a persona that was multifaceted, that represented a lot of different types of femininity and types that sometimes might be in conflict with one another. It's why I love wearing beautiful, shiny sequin dresses and beautiful jewelry and big Texas pageant hair, and then saying filthy, dirty things and talking about sex, because being vulgar and bawdy and a little bit raunchy is also a part of femininity. It's about honoring the Mae West just as much as the Marilyn Monroe. Bette Midler telling dick jokes at a bathhouse and Divine eating dog shit at the end of Pink Flamingos are just as much a part of this crazy soup that makes up my persona as any of the more glamorous icons like Cher or Celine Dion Swan or Audrey Hepburn. All of that is a part of the femininity that I want to explore and play with. And all of this exploration of femininity on stage has also impacted how I think about and express my gender identity off stage. As I've gotten older, my personal style has sort of evolved to be much more casual and in some ways less gender specific. I wear a lot of t-shirts, loose-fitting linen pants, and even tunic shirts that are sort of flowy and amorphous. Part of this has to do with being more comfortable with a bigger body and not wanting clothing that's super tight or constricting, but part of it has to do with the fact that it's not as specifically gendered. And in some ways, my look has become much more feminized in that I like lots of accessories. Life is too short for boring outfits. For several years, my fashion project was bringing brooches back. I have a big collection of rhinestone brooches that I've gotten from friends and family in my own shopping trips. And then the last couple of years, I switched over to preferring a jaunty scarf. I love big scarves that I can wear up around my neck or put around my shoulders like a wrap. I also tend to wear lots of pendants and bracelets. And the word that I always come back to is just that I like being decorated. I like having little pieces put together that all express different parts of who I am. And if people look at me and they get confused and they don't understand why I'm presenting the way that I am because of how they perceive my gender, I just have no fucks left to give. One of the times in my life when I really stopped caring much about how I presented myself or how I decorated myself was when I was married and I was going through one of the worst depressions I have ever experienced in my life. I was so close to just giving up on my entire life, and one of the ways that that manifested was in that I didn't care anything about my appearance. I didn't try to put any effort or any personality into my presentation. All of the gray, awful nothingness that I was feeling on the inside, I wanted to put on the outside. And so when my marriage was over and I started to put my life back together, I decided that I was going to be more decorated. I was going to put effort into being authentically, genuinely who I was and celebrating a type of presentation that made me happy. So this would probably be the point in the commentary where you're thinking to yourself, why do I give a shit? What does your bad marriage and a single mother and your 6-year-old desire to be Daphne so you could fuck Fred have anything to do with the term cisgender? And the reason why all of those things are important is because they're part of that gender journey. They're part of the way that I came to the place that I'm at now in terms of thinking about and defining and expressing my identity. And what happens to that when people use the term cisgender in certain ways. Now, at the beginning of this commentary, I noted that for macro level discussions, the term cisgender is wonderful. It gives us a different way of talking about people whose gender identity and experience lines up with the biological sex that they were assigned at birth without falling back on referring to it as normal. Because remember, just because something is common doesn't mean that it's normal or that it's the default. It puts different identities on equal ground, and that works wonderfully at that macro level. But what I've seen more and more within queer communities is people using the term cisgender in order to win debates and to invalidate other people's thoughts and positions about different types of gender identities or expressions because it doesn't match their own. So why do I think this happens? I think it relates back to that last line of the Wikipedia definition that I read to you earlier of the term cisgender that says it is the opposite of the term transgender. And I think that this is all the latest extension of what Judith Butler was writing about in her book, Bodies That Matter. Now, I'm about to show off my English major nerd skills and include a little bit of queer theory here, but I promise not to become too boring and academic. Judith Butler wrote a book called Gender Trouble. It's one of the foundational texts of queer theory, and in it she argues that all gender as we know it is performative. We're performing some sort of expectation or understanding of what it means to be male or female. When she wrote the follow-up book, Bodies That Matter, she talks in the introduction about how people would say, but what about the body? And so she created this next book to talk about bodies, and specifically to talk about which bodies matter in our culture and which ones do not. And in it, she sets up a discussion about certain dichotomies. Our culture loves a good dichotomy. We have dichotomies of biological physical sex, male versus versus female. We have dichotomies about gender presentation, masculine versus feminine. And we have dichotomies related to sexuality, heterosexual versus homosexual. Now, what she argues is that in any culture where you set up these sort of dichotomies, you're going to generally see one of those sides be privileged over the other. Men tend to have more power and privilege than women. Heterosexuals tend to have more power and privilege than homosexuals. And she talks about the fact that your body only really matters to our culture if it meets certain criteria. So for example, if you are male-bodied and you identify as a man and your sexuality is such that you fall in love with female-bodied women, then your body matters. And because of that, it appears normal. And she talks about the fact that our culture has expanded, where we still have a dichotomy between straight and gay, but slowly through activism and through social change, bodies that are identified as lesbian or gay have started to matter, which is great for the people who have those bodies. But if you identify as bisexual or pansexual or asexual or omnisexual or sapiosexual or any other of the vast variety of sexual identities that aren't either heterosexual or lesbian or gay, then you're still left out of that dichotomy. It's the problem of building anything that looks like a binary. No matter what you put on either end of that binary, you're always going to have other identities emerge that call the whole nature of the binary into question. And the same thing, I think, is happening with cisgender and transgender. It's amazing that transgender is finally starting to be recognized and validated, and that we're taking the rights of trans people seriously, and that we're having discussions that include trans voices. But at the same time, we're also building a new dichotomy. And that dichotomy has cisgender on one side and transgender on the other. And so if you raise your voice and you say things about gender that come from your experience, there are some people who will try to silence you by saying, oh, well, if you're not transgender, you must be cisgender. And if you're cisgender, then your thoughts and feelings and opinions about gender don't matter. Now let's talk about a couple of reasons why that's just not fucking okay, and why it actually works against what most trans people are trying to accomplish. The first thing that it does is it continues to otherize transgender, and really anything that's not cisgender. Because if you speak up about gender and someone dismisses you by saying that you are cisgender, so your opinion or your perspective doesn't matter, what it does is it takes that person who's being identified as cisgender and it once again places them as the default, and it otherizes anything else outside of that. It's just a continuation of this weird ideological structure that we set up where only the marginalized groups are thought to be affected by a structure. So only non-white people are thought to have a racial or ethnic identity. Only non-heterosexual people are thought to have a sexual identity. Only non-cisgender people are thought to have a gender identity. And so rather than being integral parts of everybody's identities and experiences, things like race and gender and sexuality become problems for marginalized people to solve. And that's just not true. Everybody has a gender identity. Everybody has a sexual identity. Everybody has a racial and ethnic identity. When we treat gender and sex and race and ethnicity as problems that need to be solved, we give a certain amount of ownership to those marginalized groups to be able to name and define it, something that traditionally has been denied to them, but at the same time, it still treats those mainstream identities as normal, as the default. We need to find new ways of thinking about and talking about these identities that allows people who belong to those more common identifications to be able to think critically and engage with their racial identity, their ethnic identity, their sexual identity, and their gender identity, and not just as oppressor. We need white people to be able to think about whiteness in a critical way, to understand that what they experience as white people is their racial identity. And yes, part of that identity includes privilege. And yes, we absolutely need to critique privilege. But white people are not entirely defined by the privilege that they have because of their whiteness. In the same way, men are not entirely defined by the privilege that they have because of their maleness. And straight people are not entirely defined by the privileges that they have because of their straightness. And in that same way, cisgender people are not defined entirely by the privileges that they have by being cisgender. And so while we need to be critical, we also need to create a space where people who belong to those common identifications have a larger role to play than just villain or oppressor. The other reason why I feel that dismissive use of cisgender is not appropriate is because it reinforces passing privilege. And I think a good example of that is if we look historically at Caitlyn Jenner. Now, I know people feel all types of ways about Caitlyn Jenner, and I certainly am among those people. The painful lesson that I think we all learned from Caitlyn Jenner is that being part of a minority or marginalized community does not automatically make you a good role model or even a good human being. But no matter what I think about her Trump-supporting politics or her sometimes essentialist views about what does or does not qualify as trans, I still absolutely think she deserves the right that every person should have to name and define her identity. And so people who misgender her or dead name her are absolutely wrong. But because she's a public figure, and if we think about Caitlyn Jenner in certain ways, I think it opens up an interesting and broader discussion about what it means to be gendered in our culture. There are certain people who speak, now that Caitlyn has come out, she had that Vanity Fair cover, call me Kate. And people, very rightfully so, say that it's inappropriate to speak of her using male pronouns or to use her old name. But we have the benefit of her public declaration of her gender identity to help shape those arguments. What if Caitlyn Jenner had not come out as trans before the 2016 election? What if she had made some of the exact same statements supporting Trump and about sexuality and same-sex marriage and transgender rights that she made as Caitlyn, but had not publicly declared that identity? If she had still been publicly presenting as Bruce Jenner, would people have dismissed her as, you don't get to comment on these topics because you're cisgender? Again, looking at it now with the perspective of her public declaration of her gender identity, people will say, well, no, she was always Kate Jenner. That was always her internal truth. But if she hadn't made that internal truth known, does that mean that she doesn't have the right to define her own gender? Because without that public declaration, people would still be using male pronouns and they would still be using her prior name. And so in that context, if somebody dismisses her as, oh, you're just cisgender, because she hasn't, for whatever reason, made that public declaration, doesn't that take away her ability to name and define her own gender identity? So it privileges those people who are willing or able to publicly declare themselves as something other than cisgender. And once you dismiss somebody's perspective by saying, oh, you're cisgender, if that person is not cisgender, then you've placed them into an untenable position. They now have to choose between publicly declaring their gender identity in order to counter the claim that you've just made about their identity, or preserve their privacy and have their ability to name their own identity taken away. If that sort of position sounds familiar to you, it should. When people do it to closeted gay Republicans, they call it outing. If you are going to predicate someone's ability to comment on a social structure like gender on them having some sort of alternative identity, you are simultaneously reinforcing cisgender as the norm and forcing someone to either out themselves in order to have an opinion or refuse to out themselves and have their position invalidated. And this is why I don't think cisgender works as well on the micro level, when we're talking individually, person to person, human to human. And that's why, unless somebody has specifically told me they identify their gender identity for whatever reason as cisgender, I am not going to name somebody else's gender for them, because I don't know what journey brought them to where they are today. The same way that somebody who might refer to me as cisgender doesn't understand how I think about or how I identify or how I experience and describe my gender. I don't identify as cisgender. I also don't identify as transgender. I'm not even really sure that there is a name for what I feel and think about in terms of my own gender experience. The term that for me comes closest right now is gender variant or gender non-conforming. And I recognize that my experience is very different from the experiences of other people. I understand that people feel very strongly about being able to choose and have their pronouns respected. And I absolutely champion their right to do so. But I don't have preferred pronouns. There are some people who know me through the shows that I do and only refer to me by female pronouns. There are some people who know me off stage and only refer to me by male pronouns. And there are some people who refer to me by either, based on how I happen to be presenting that day. There are some people who choose to use plural pronouns, non-gender specific, they, them, theirs. All of those pronouns work for me. And I don't really have a strong preference. When I'm in drag, I always prefer female pronouns, but outside of drag, I don't really care. As long as you approach me respectfully, I'm not really concerned about whether you use male pronouns or female pronouns or plural pronouns. When I take part in introduction activities where we have to name our preferred pronouns, I always say that I'm pronoun friendly. And what I mean by that is that I'm open to any pronoun as long as it's presented to me in a way that's respectful. I mean, obviously, don't call me it. That's probably the only pronoun I wouldn't accept. But there are some people who act as if saying that I'm pronoun friendly and not choosing one of the available options and leaving open multiple options is somehow disrespecting their journey. That somehow a trans person's desire to have a specific pronoun and have that respected is somehow invalidated because I don't give a shit about my pronouns. It has nothing to do with their pronouns. If you tell me you want female pronouns, I'll use female pronouns. If you tell me you want male pronouns, I'll use male pronouns. If you tell me you prefer plural, I'll use plural. And if you like one of those new pronouns that's been made up to help address some of the inadequacies of our current gender system, like Z or them, I'll use that too. What has upset people in the past isn't the pronouns that I'm using for them or me respecting their ability to define their own gender and pick their own pronouns. They're upset about the pronouns that I'm choosing for myself, or rather refusing to choose. But my specific gender journey does not require me to use specific pronouns. It doesn't require me to choose to fit within one of those little boxes. And so I don't. But I recognize that that's not true for everyone. For some people, it is really important. For some people, it's vital. And I think it's much more important for us to be able to sit down and have a discussion about why I feel the way I feel and why you feel the way you feel, and share those experiences and try to come together rather than trying to figure out who wins. Because every time I turn around, it looks like somebody is now trying to win the great oppression cook-off. We always have to find out who is the most oppressed, who struggles the most, because somehow that person has more authority to speak than anyone else. And while I recognize that voices that have been pushed to the side have to be given their moment to speak, when we start to turn oppression and marginalization into a contest, then nobody wins. So if you're using the term cisgender in order to validate a multitude of different gender identities and to decentralize the sort of gender presentation that's been treated as normal, then it sounds like you're probably doing some good things. If you're using the term cisgender about a public figure who hasn't publicly identified their gender identity, whatever it may be, then you may want to tread lightly. Nobody wants to infringe on somebody else's right to name and identify their own experience. You never know who's going to be the next person on the cover of Vanity Fair. And if you're using the term cisgender to win an argument, you may want to spend a little time reflecting on the types of spaces and dialogues you're trying to create. My guest for this episode is always thinking about how to create respectful and inclusive spaces. She is the co-host of two fabulous podcasts, The Inciting Incident and The Cis Are Getting Out of Hand. She's a published author with 5 books and a 6th forthcoming this spring, and she's also a dynamic conference and event speaker. You can find out more about her and her work at rismccool.com. That's RISMCCOOL.com. I am very pleased to welcome Marissa Alexa McCool. So, Marissa Alexa McCool, you are the host of a couple of podcasts. Do you want to tell me a little bit about those?
Sure. I host 2 weekly podcasts and I produce 4 others. My main show is the Inciting Incident podcast. I would call it a personal, in-depth interview kind of show. Especially recently, we've kind of taken people's stories and gone on some in-depth journeys with them. We've had the chance to talk to all kinds of people. Recently, I had a girl on that I called Lesbian Batgirl. She just had the coolest story of starting out as a Southern Baptist, becoming a prison guard, and then coming out as gay and becoming a professional belly dancer. I'm like, your life is so much cooler than mine. The second show I do is a trans-specific show called The Cis Are Getting Out of Hand, because they are and they do. And I host that with a non-binary person named Ari Stillman. The whole purpose of the show, I like to affectionately call it Trans Happy Hour, because so many of us trans activists have to do 101 all the time. We created a space that is, let's just bitch about the cis for an hour without having to stop and define everything. So we'll pick an issue, and then the first part will always be a skit where we enact that idea, whether it's just some problematic interaction or even just, I didn't like that scene in the movie, whatever it is. And then we talk about it, and then we always have a heck the cis portion. It can be anything from this person misgendered me to fuck 45 for banning us. So we don't hold back, I guess would be a good way to put it.
I like that. It sounds like a lot of fun. I think a lot of queer folks of all different kinds, they really end up doing that. And I think I see it a lot more, especially because I live in North Dakota. So nobody knows anything about anybody who's not like straight white people. And so you always end up doing that 101 introduction. Let me tell you all about my life story and how I came to be the way that I am. And they don't understand that there's anything outside of that introduction. We have whole lives that don't just involve explaining to you why we exist.
Mm-hmm. Especially when they expect to see, if they expect to see us represented in the media at all. It can be like, oh, what'd you have for lunch today? I'm trans!
Yeah. Yeah. North Dakota's kind of an interesting place to hang out. I don't know how to describe it. It should be like that Stephen King Under the Dome. Somebody should put a dome over North Dakota and we should be studied scientifically. You know, North Dakota has this kind of rich history of rebellion, you know, back with the cattle barons, and you had these workers rising up, and it's sort of morphed into this very conservative place, but yet our representatives are usually almost always Democrats because they're the ones who are looking out for the farm programs. And we love the farm programs, but we hate welfare programs, which doesn't make sense because farm programs are welfare programs. You live in constant inconsistency. The only thing that's consistent is inconsistency.
Oh, of course. If we didn't have blatant hypocrisy and selective approval of social nets, what else would it be but America?
Yeah, I love it. I love to travel and I love to meet interesting people, so I was very excited when Georgia was sending me along. You need to be friends with this person.
Georgia is everybody's fairy godmother, I think. She recommends writing assignments to me all the time, and I'm like, girl, I haven't even seen you in 6 months and you're still thinking about me. You are awesome.
So speaking of writing assignments, I know that you are also a published author.
That is true, yep.
So tell me a little bit about your books.
The one I'm most known for is the first one I put out under my correct name, and it's called The PC Lied, How American Voters Decided I Don't Matter. I wrote it 6 days after the election. I was just inundated with that election, more so than even the rest of the country, because I went to the same school that the person who won it went to. Even from when he was just talking about running, we were overrun with media and people asking us questions like, what do you think of what he tweeted and all that shit. It was so surreal. It was a time I don't think I'll ever forget. And I ended up putting it out so quickly because I had just come out publicly like a month earlier. With everything happening, it was just kind of lightning in a bottle. I reached out to people, and Chris Kluwe, the former Vikings punter, wrote my foreword, and I had it out before the end of the year. So I may not have written the best book about Trump, but I definitely wrote the first one about his presidency. I would say odds are good. And it starts with the words, fuck you. So I feel like it started on an appropriate line, you know?
Yeah, it sets the right tone. What I'm fascinated by is just the fact that, I mean, he was such a shit show during that whole election, and then he got elected, and people keep acting surprised that he's still a shit show. And it's like, you had a year and a half of him showing you exactly what he's like. Why did you think that he would get elected and suddenly become presidential?
Well, you have this whole, I just thought he was going to embolden my racism. I didn't know he would actually be bad for people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to be able to, say slurs and not get in trouble for it. I didn't want to get nuked.
And that revolving cabinet. I mean, every time you turn on the news, somebody's getting fired and there's somebody who's being replaced.
It's almost like we shouldn't hire a reality show guy who's famous for firing people to be the head of the country or something.
Yeah, that doesn't really speak to the longevity of anyone's position. Except for that, she's going to win the season. That Sarah Sanders Huckabee, whatever her name is. Because
I don't know.
Linda's
been there. Linda McMahon's been there since the beginning. Maybe there's something to that.
Well, that's true. They're going to be the final two. They'll be duking it out.
Yeah, and one of them will get the rose or whatever. I don't know how that shit works.
Yeah, I don't either. I don't watch reality TV anymore. And now, thanks to Trump, I don't watch reality. I just try to stay out of it.
Yeah, so I also have 2 novels. One is called False Start, and the other one's called Voice in the Dark. I have a book of poetry and essays called Silent Dreams. I have a personal internal monologue book called Passing Cars, the internal monologue of a neurodivergent trans girl. And right now I am putting the finishing touches on book 6, which is called Once Unspoken, the monologues of the previously unheard. I'm hoping to have it out by May. It's designed in the spirit of Eve Ensler's The Vagina monologues, except not just for white, cis, het 90s feminists. I have trans women contributing, trans men contributing, because they are noticeably absent from a show that contains something that they're born with. I have a couple of women of color. I tried to reach out to as many different kinds of people as I could, instead of just trying to assume experience and speak to only one narrative. I'm really proud of this one. The roughest one that I had to get through, and that's even a terrible way to put it, but up in Duluth, when I had a cup of coffee at UMD, and when I thought grad school was a good idea after 6 years of undergrad, I met a woman, and her son was murdered a couple months ago. She's been speaking out at a lot of the March for Our Lives protests and everything like that. Her son was 19 and just got murdered in his apartment by his roommate, and it breaks my heart. The imagery she uses will probably never leave me. It's just one of those things of someone trusted me with this story, so I must be doing something right.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that sounds really good. And when is that one coming out?
I'm hoping to have it out by May. I'm waiting on a couple of contributions. A couple of the girls that I went to school with at Penn, they got finals and everything coming up, and I know how that can be. So, I'm hoping they can get it to me as soon as possible, but for the most part, everybody else has turned their stuff in. That
reminded me of, there's somebody that I met through horror conventions. I have this weird affinity now with horror conventions. Are you a horror fan?
Not at all.
Not at all? Okay. I met her, and she runs this film festival for woman-identified filmmakers. And we had a really interesting conversation. And actually, she's going to be a guest on one of the upcoming episodes, where she said she really struggled with, what does that mean to say you're going to have a film festival for woman-identified directors? And so she's like, how do I define that? And how do I put that out there to make sure that it's inclusive and that it's done respectfully? And what she came to with some discussions of people that she worked with and people that she was familiar with, she really came up with this idea of, we're going to put it out there. And obviously they're recruiting people as well. And they're going out and meeting filmmakers and soliciting films, but they're also just putting out a call and saying, we would like woman-identified directors, and letting people sort of self-select in or self-select out, and really kind of then talk about, what is your story? Where did you come to this place? It's led to this really sort of richly diverse selection of films that come in, because she gets women who just grew up on the Midwest, really didn't have much experience beyond that, all the way to people who are trans women, also trans men who don't identify as women anymore, but recognize that they were raised in a culture that expected them to be a certain way because of what they were assigned at birth. And so a really interesting group of perspectives, and the film festival is really rich and diverse in what it shows. And they solicit all kinds of films, any sort of genre films. So genres where women are typically underrepresented. So horror and sci-fi, Western, anything that's not a big rom-com, you can do a little bit of everything. So it's really fantastic. They have some really amazing short films that they tour around the country.
I love hearing stories like that. I was in a film program at school. It was one of the 3 things I was majoring in. There are so many brilliant women that will just never get a shot because that is still such a male-dominated mainstream.
Yeah, it's so difficult. And there was something that just came up, again, because I have this weird connection to this traveling group of people who go to all these horror conventions. There was actually some women who had gone to Horror Hound in Cincinnati, I believe. And there was this film that was being screened and actually won one of the Horror Hound awards. And I think it's called the Miranda Files or the Miranda Murders. It's sort of a found footage style horror film. And it depicts real events. So it's a real murder that took place. And so they did this film and people were kind of already unsettled by it in terms of how it was presented. It was presented in this really voyeuristic kind of way. From my understanding, I haven't watched it. I do have to say that I haven't watched it myself, but it sounds like it didn't have a lot of empathy for the victim. Someone referred to it as torture porn. But what really upset some people that I knew that were there was this panel discussion of indie filmmakers, and they were kind of joking about how, well, it's just acting, but can you believe that I'm getting an award for like making a movie where I show you how to rape a woman? And they were really like dismissive. It just left people feeling really kind of creeped out. And even in this place where there's supposed to be this, you know, kind of acceptance of all the freaks coming together and bonding over this love of horror film, that there's still this kind of undercurrent of all this kind of gross yuck happening underneath.
Yeah, you picked the best word for it, that's for sure.
I don't know about the film. It sounded like the film could have had some potential as being kind of an interesting meditation on modern horror and what we could choose to look at, but it's just the video from the convention of the people on the panel is just so sickening.
I've learned never to be surprised by this shit anymore. I feel almost jaded at hearing that, but yeah, I'm with you.
Someday my tombstone is going to read, "She never saw it coming." Because I feel like that's my life. I wish that I could, I'm constantly surprised by some of the stupidity that I see in the world. You would think I would be over it at some point, that I would just be like, yep, somebody being stupid again. Still catches me off guard.
I found if you don't have expectations of people, they can't disappoint you. So that runs different with a specific person, you know, an individual that you know, as opposed to groups of people. Mm-hmm. Especially these days, you wake up and you go, okay, what did people fuck up today?
Yeah. So I think that this is actually a good place to segue into some of your activism as well. From my minor Facebook creeping, by the way, I know that you travel to conventions and conferences and things like that, and you do a lot of keynotes and workshops. Tell me a little bit more about the type of activism that you do.
My true love has always been speaking live in front of an audience. I've been writing since I was 4 years old. You know, I do the podcasts and all that stuff, but nothing makes me feel more alive than performing in front of a live crowd. And with the theater background that I do have, combined with my ability to write stuff and improvise things on the spot, I've been fortunate enough to not only have some speaking engagements, but also to give a really unique kind of speaking engagement. Lots of years in improv theater have meant that I don't really have to plan anything and it can come off sounding very rehearsed. Even when I have written speeches, I've gotten pretty good responses to them. I move around in a lot of circles, LGBT ones, obviously, some of the secular, I hesitate to even say the word atheist anymore just because of some of the people in that particular community that are just as harmful as the ones in religious ones, but that's neither here nor there right now. I tend to participate more in the ones that consider themselves humanists, social justice, like I said, LGBT. I also get invited to do some regular lectures. I can't say that any of the speaking engagements that I've had have been anything alike each other, but I tend to blend sort of the lecture style with theatrical performance. So I always start with one, end with one, and probably have one in the middle. I write monologue style and very direct and very verbose. And sometimes I don't even introduce myself. I just jump right into one of my more aggressive ones. And that gets people's attention right away. So it puts me in a position where I can, I would say, connect with people as if I didn't get their attention enough by being a 6-foot purple-haired trans girl. I get to sort of also come out and just, you know, be so direct and jump right into it. Like one of the pieces that I actually got to perform for the Vagina Monologues is called Ode to the Block. And it's just a compilation of all the shitty things people have said to me since I started to come out. And I read it very rapid fire. So I come out and just start saying these horrible things one after the other. And at first, you may not even know why I'm doing it, but then just the vibe of the piece, you start to get it. But that's also when I'm going into a cis-centered space or something like that. I wouldn't go into an LGBT center or one of those kind of conventions because I wouldn't feel the need to make them confront those realities. The true nature of trying to create allies is to make our experience accessible so that not only do they know how to defend it, but they know what they're defending. I like to think that I can make our experience as accessible as possible without also allowing them to appropriate it. That's generally how I blend all the stuff I do together into whatever it is that people want to hear me say more stuff about. I'm really starting to get some gigs that I'm blown away that anybody has thought of me for. I'll be speaking at one called the Free Thought Alliance this August in Orange County, and it's honestly the first time anyone ever asked if I had an honorarium. And of course, in the moment, I didn't even know what that was.
So I'm interested in what you think, because you go to these events and you are in the activism and also sort of observing it and looking at it. And you even mentioned, you know, the way that you tailor yourself to different venues. What I'm interested in terms of activism, I'm getting older. I just turned 40 this year. And I remember being the super out and proud stage 5 queer. I was ready to go and I want to just gay everything. And what I've seen change in activism for LGBTQ is really sort of unsettling to me, because I feel like on one hand you have the sort of establishment politics. And so especially with the whole marriage equality debate, it was really about trying to get any sense of the sexual out of homosexual. We had to make sure that everybody looked like nice, mostly white straight folks. You could have 2 lesbians, but they had to look as much like their straight neighbors as possible. And they always had to be sort of upper middle class. And, you know, we're almost always white and we're very soft spoken. We just want to join the local bridge club and pay our taxes and just be wonderful citizens. And there was no edge or no queerness to it. And you certainly didn't see any trans folk. You certainly didn't talk about bisexuality. I mean, even that would have like blown people's minds in that activism. And then I feel like on the other extreme, you have this activism that I find very exciting because I feel like it is more aggressive and I feel like it's like we're done waiting for people to give us rights. We're going to start taking rights, or we're going to start doing things to be more aggressive about it. But at the same time, it feels like it's so compassionless. It feels like we're just out for blood. Coming from North Dakota, you would wear yourself out because you're just constantly on guard. And so I'm interested in those two extremes and like, where does compassion fit into the activism of today?
It's hard to say. I can really only speak for the kind that I do, because I don't know the motivations of the other people and what they do, at least beyond the way I interview them and the way I interact with them and listen to them. I like to think I belong to a small network of trans podcasts and media creators who do fall on the side of compassion, but are also unapologetic about who they are. And I think that's the key difference. If you're trying to connect with the cis straight world, there's what you have to do to supposedly be one of them, and there's what you have to do to be accepted by them. And those are two completely different things. And I think trying to move in with same-sex marriage and everything was all about showing that we were just like them, but in the process, we lost a lot of that identity, or at least that visible identity, because we were trying to compromise. I can relate to this, especially being a trans person, because you have that urge whenever you come out to immediately start negotiating before anyone can say anything. So you'll be like, I'm trans, but don't worry, I don't care if you mess up my pronouns, or don't worry, I'm not going to get the surgery. Like, you're immediately changing the conversation to make it more acceptable to them. It's all about striking a balance between those two things. I don't hide my queerness whatsoever, and I live in a space where anybody who doesn't accept me and call me the right name and everything, I just don't give them the time of day. But I can't act like that when I'm on stage, especially if I'm being paid to speak. But I can bring as much of that as I possibly can into a performance or into a lecture. If I'm going to Allentown, Pennsylvania, I'm going to start off with that because it gets their attention. But then there's also the part about being compassionate and relaying the experience and what it is that we go through and what people can do about it. But if I'm going to go to, say, Flint, Michigan, and talk with Standing Rock folk, people who would just really like to have drinkable water, I'm not going to yell shit at them. Why on earth would I do that? I don't even know why I'm the one talking there, and I communicated as much. I'm standing there with natives who are at Standing Rock going, why am I the one talking right now? This doesn't make sense. So I really think we're so tired of being targeted, and we're so tired of seeing Republicans do anything they can to make it legal to discriminate against us, whether that's buying a cake or getting health care, that we get so enraged at everybody. And that's, of course, understandable, but there are people out there who are on our side. And I'm not saying that not being nice means you'll alienate allies, but I am saying that if we don't make our experience accessible in any way, if we're not willing to take that moment to go, here's what we go through, and here's a way that you can understand it, even if you can't relate to it, we're not helping ourselves. Of course, with, the way you were talking, it's like you have to make everything rich and white. That's the way to get it into the mainstream. But now that it is in the mainstream, they need to stop turning around and gatekeeping in their own fucking community.
I had this weird experience because I've become sort of a de facto advisor to the campus group here at UND because I've just been around and I never left, and I help them with their drag show. So I'm like the creepy old person that just shows up to meetings and is like, well, in my day, we used to do this. And at one point, there was this person who was working with their student organization center. They had finally added like a student position to work with LGBTQ issues, and he had organized this event called Coffee with the Queers, and he wanted to invite the group to come, and they had this discussion that blew my fucking mind, and I just could not believe it. There was somebody who brought up, well, should you really call it Coffee with the Queers? Because what if like an ally reads that, and what if that word queer makes them uncomfortable, and then they don't come, and so like what if our allies don't want to come to our events because we used the wrong words? And it went on for probably longer than it should have. And finally, of course, I had to, because I'm loud and mouthy, I had to sort of jump in and I said, here's the situation. I appreciate that you're trying to look out for people's feelings to a point, but if somebody is so uncomfortable that the word queer on a poster would make them not come to an event, then they are not your fucking ally.
Right.
It's just that idea that we have to make ourselves more and more palatable to our allies. And it's like, well, no, that's not what an ally is. An ally should be defending you and helping you and assisting you where you are, not where they are.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah,
so,
and, it's about being accessible, but not at the expense of who you are, and not necessarily bending over backwards just to make sure that they aren't uncomfortable because people are different. We've had to do that enough throughout our lives.
Yeah, it was so strange. How do you negotiate, especially being active on social media, how do you negotiate that way of finding an audience?
I run into it a lot more on my social media than I do in my work because I'm not subtle about who I am and what I do. Anybody tuning into my show is going to pick up pretty much right away who I am and how I do things. I have found the resistance to be, if I end up not liking a thing because of a bad trans joke or anything like that, the straight white guys descend from the rafters to be like, oh, if you look for something to be offended by, you're going to be offended. This happened most recently. I was watching a movie I should have seen before and never had, Love Actually, and there were 2 fucking trans jokes that were so unnecessary. And it's just like, really? I don't need this shit. And that's why I don't watch a lot of things, because I don't want to find new things that are going to hurt me. And I don't want to find things in ones that I used to like where I'm going to go, oh, forgot about that shitty trans joke right there. Wish I had kept it forgotten.
Yeah, exactly. I'm fascinated by the concept of fandom. I think that fandom itself is very interesting because it seems like every year it just gets more and more sort of aggressive.
That toxicity, especially when you're seen as the social default and everything is generally considered to have you as the universal perspective. I was helping someone with their thesis about this the other day. When something for so long is considered the default, the universal perspective. And that has generally, in most media until recently, been the straight, cis, white guy. But when you have that, literally anything else is considered responsive. So it either responds to that or subverts it, but it's also always categorized that way. A movie like, say, Boys in the Hood is considered responding to the straight, cis, white male narrative by openly rejecting it or subverting it. You know, it's always compared to, it's always otherized in that way. So when you cater to a certain group of people and make them feel like they're the universal perspective, anything else feels like you're invading their thing, not realizing that, hey, maybe people other than you might like to have some stuff for their own. Imagine that.
Yeah, I'm sorry that this 5% of big budget Hollywood media isn't for you. We apologize. We'll try to do better.
Isn't only for you. Like,
yeah.
That's the, like, you introduce anything and it's all PC's out of control. They have diversity checklists, blah, blah, blah. We don't have it. And white men can only be the bad guys anymore. It's like, oh, I'll just go watch every other fucking movie ever made then, and I'll get back to you.
There's something also about fandom. They want the same story over and over and over again. And I guess I've just never been wired that way. I'm a big fan of the X-Men. In terms of like superhero nerdiness, that's always been my favorite, is the X-Men. And people always want Wolverine in everything. The fanboys just want Wolverine. So at one point, I was trying to keep up with the comic books, and I had to stop because the writers would just throw Wolverine into every single book to sell shit. I mean, it just became so ridiculous. At one point, he was like in space with this team, but he was also on the run from the government with this team. But then he had his own book, and he was like off on his own looking for his son, and all of this was supposed to be happening concurrently. And I'm like, they're just giving up any sense of trying to build a continuity just to satisfy these fanboys who want to see Wolverine on every single page.
Yeah, like I said, when you're the social default and you like a thing, you want everything to be that thing. Certain group of people have been catered to with pretty much everything. So it's like, yeah, more of that. Don't give me anything different, because then otherwise PC culture is taking over.
And they just don't know how to respond, which is how then you get a film like Get Out being nominated for a comedy category, which was fascinating. So did you see Get Out at all?
I haven't seen a new movie in probably 2 or 3 years, to be honest.
It was really good. It's called a horror film, or some people call it a thriller. I think of it more as just sort of a social commentary film. It's got some really pointed criticisms about race and all these things, and it was nominated in the comedy category. Just the Twitter reaction. I only have Twitter really so that I can go and yell at Delta when they lose my luggage, but every once in a while I do enjoy watching the Twitter response to shenanigans that happen. And the Twitter response to Get Out being nominated as a comedy was pretty fantastic. It was pretty good. Something that I'm kind of percolating for myself, for how I engage with the world, that I'm kind of thinking about, and that I want to ask you about, is the word cisgender.
Mm-hmm.
I just am really interested in terms of how it fits in with discussions of gender and politics and all that sort of thing. And I want you to tell me a little bit about that word and how you use that word.
I use it as a description. Some people would say that the name of my show is inflammatory, and if that's the case, they're missing the joke. But for the most part, it's just a description that puts things on equal footing, because so often you'll hear someone say, oh, I'm not cisgender, you're going to say normal, aren't you? You know, you motherfucker, you're going to try to say normal, fuck you. I think the cisgender experience is completely valid. You know, I'm not going to take that away from them, but when they're unwilling to see anything beyond their own experience and think that we're making it up or exaggerating or don't know who we are or think they have more of a right to our identity than we do, that's where I have a problem with it. It all comes down to privilege and experience. Cis people really don't have the right to deny us our experience. As trans people, the same way that me as a white person, I don't have the place to tell my native friends what their experience is, because that's not how it works. When you're in a position of privilege, you don't get to tell marginalized group how to behave. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I'm just struggling with that word so much lately. On the one hand, I absolutely agree with you in terms of, you know, having some sort of term to even out the language, because I think we do this with other identities as well. We act like only non-white people have a racial identity. No, everybody has a racial identity and an ethnic identity. It's just for some people, it's so much the norm and it's so much what they're used to they don't see it as that. They just see it as everything that they're surrounded by. And so it helps put a name to that. I wonder if it, in some ways and in some contexts, can reinforce passing privilege. And the reason why I say that, part of it has just been my own sort of evolution of my gender identity and how I think about gender and how I think about myself. I've been a drag performer for a long time. One of the things that I think has come out of emergence of drag as more of a mainstream cultural thing has been some of the discussion around different types of identities of people who do drag. Because I think it's very easy to sort of dismiss drag queens. Well, you're just a cisgender person who performs gender, which I think eliminates the diversity of people who choose to perform in drag for all different kinds of reasons. For me, I just have been worrying that what if there's somebody who maybe hasn't come out with a specific sort of gender identity, has some sort of passing privilege. Are we erasing their ability to identify themselves by using that term?
I don't think so. Once again, I speak to only my own experience, but my problem with drag is not with the performers, unless they're transphobic, which is somehow a thing. It's more with wondering if my cis friends are unable to tell the difference between drag and who I am. That to me is much more of a concern. And I know there are a lot of drag performers who use drag to experiment and find who they are. It's just not my thing, and I don't want to take that away from anybody. But there are times, especially when it's a cis person, will say things like, oh, do you watch Drag Race? No. Well, why don't you? They celebrate queerhood so much, and you should blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, because the host says ridiculously transphobic things. And then on top of it, it's like, do you know the difference between a drag queen and a trans woman? Or do you think it's the same? So that's where I tend to get uncomfortable.
And that's, I can tell you, audiences in North Dakota, we sometimes have to have a little sit down and have a little education moment. So let's talk about all the different kinds of gender identities and expressions that you might hear about tonight. Because there are some that can't tell the difference. They really don't understand that there is a difference. And so I think that what you're saying absolutely makes sense to me. I think it's just my own I'm sort of percolating all kinds of things all the time. And I've had this growing discomfort with it. And I read this article about somebody that really kind of resonated for my experience. And I think the way that a lot of people do, I certainly do. I'm like, well, it feels uncomfortable to me, so I don't know if maybe it should be uncomfortable for everybody else. And I'm not sure that it actually should be uncomfortable for everybody else. What they were saying in this article is they said, I'm often referred to as cisgender, and people don't know my gender journey. Like, they don't know where I'm at. Just because they read me as being a certain thing, and then they assign that label to me, it's taking away that ability. I'm never really offended. I'm always just sort of surprised when people call me cisgender, because I think that obviously I look very different out of drag than I do in drag, but I have never been super gender conforming. My personal style is sort of like a 57-year-old lesbian women's studies professor who just got back from a shamanistic retreat in Sedona. I love flowy scarves and like tunic shirts, and I'm always dressed like maybe I'm about to go to Lilith Fair, but so I'm always fascinated, and I'm just like, when people are like, well, you're just a typical man, and I was like, where are you meeting typical men that I'm the model for typical men for you?
Right. And I think the key of what you're saying is shouldn't assume people's identity. I think that's a terrible idea.
So a couple fun questions too, because it can't all be business.
Of course not.
I want to know, so if you're like, do you have cable?
Kind of.
I used to ask this question all the time. And then I realized that even I don't have cable anymore, I just have Netflix. So maybe this is even past tense, but is there a movie that when you are or when you were flipping through cable, if you ran across it, you had to watch it all the way to the end? Like you were done. Like you turned it on and you'd be like, oh, I'm done.
No, not really. I think especially ever since I got a degree in film, I think it's kind of been ruined for me.
Yeah.
Because I spent so much time studying it from that aspect that it's really difficult to watch a movie just for the shits of it anymore. And I don't know if I'll ever get that back, but I have very eccentric and eclectic tastes. So I don't like very many things as it is, but what I do like, I really like.
I don't know what it is. It was never my favorite movie, but there was something about The American President. I don't know if you ever saw that. It was from the 90s with Annette Bening. It's so good. And right now, with 45, they should be playing it on cable 24 hours a day.
Yeah, that and episodes of The West Wing.
Yeah, they should, just to remind people that sometimes tyrants take over and you can fight back. It's okay. But that one, it would come on and I would have to watch that and Dirty Dancing. Those were the two that if they came on, I was like, shit, well, there goes my day.
I never really watched movies on TV as much. I don't really have that experience, I guess. If I ever wanted to watch a movie, I'd watch it because I intended to. And, back when Blockbuster and all those places were a thing, I worked there for several years. So I guess I got used to seeking it out rather than coming upon it.
It's much more intentional, which is better than just you're folding laundry so you flip on cable and then you get sucked into some stupid movie.
And once again, I revert to the fact that I have podcasts. So
yeah,
I have so many podcast descriptions that I am never short of material.
I'm just recently getting into more podcasts. And it's actually, I can't believe I didn't discover this earlier because I like to do a lot of crafting. And so watching new movies is hard for me because I'm always like doing something with my hands. I'm always, playing around, making jewelry, or I'm sewing or doing whatever. And so I would watch the same movies over and over and over again because my ear could just kind of cue into what was happening and I could imagine what was on the screen. Like I knew it so well. And now podcasts are wonderful because I just have to listen to them. I don't have to look at anything.
Yeah, that's part of the reason I like it as opposed to doing videos. I don't have to worry about where my eyes are and if the lighting's okay. You just focus on what you're saying.
Well, thank you very much. Anything else that you just want our World of Champagne listeners, our Janessa After Dark listeners to know about you?
Easiest way to find out more about any of my stuff is at RissMcCool.com, RISMCCOOL. All my books, all my podcasts, and most of my writing stuff is there. I put out 2 new episodes of podcasting a week. The Inciting Incident podcast will be putting out episode number 136 this week, and The Sister Getting Out of Hand is 1 year old, so 52nd episode there. I have a live show coming up for our 150th episode in Chicago. And our 100th episode, we had a blast. It was a live theater show. We got Chris Cluey to fly in because he is the only straight cis white man I would go straight for. And we had a bunch of others, a hero of mine, No Illusions, and I'm besties with his wife. A bunch of other podcasters. We had a great time. So number 150 is going to have some of the activists that I admire the most, including my friend Nandisa Thomas, who is the founder and president of Black Nonbelievers, my friend Alex Jules, who is an activist from Texas, and a couple other really interesting guests. So looking forward to that. Pretty much, if you're looking for any of the stuff I do, put it into your podcatcher or anything like that. I have been on hundreds of podcasts. My books are available on Amazon and all the bookstores like that. And if you like what you hear, I'd love to hear from you. I'm not hard to find. Just look for the purple one.
Perfect. Well, thanks very much for this impromptu interview.
Absolutely. Anytime.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Marissa Alexa McCool, and definitely go check out her podcasts, The Inciting Incident and The Cis Are Getting Out of Hand. I was introduced to Marissa through our mutual friend Georgia. You'll get to hear a little bit more about her as well as some other great outtakes in our upcoming Sloppy Seconds episode, which will feature some great outtakes from Marissa as well as Jerry LaRue, and some brand new content I recorded with Erica Kaufman, our guest from episode 4, after my computer decided to eat her outtakes. That episode will be coming very soon from Janessa After Dark, as well as our very first edition of what I'm calling the very special episode. For news about these episodes and more, you can always follow me on Facebook or Instagram, and you can always find more information about my podcasts, my blogs, my makeup reviews, as well as live performances and events at janessaj.com, the world of champagne. It's my world, baby. You're just living in it. This episode of Janessa After Dark features royalty-free music from bensound.com. The tracks included in this episode are Actionable, which serves as our podcast intro, Sunny, which played during Marissa's intro and outro, and the song Sexy, which you're listening to now. For these great royalty-free tracks and more, make sure you check out bensound.com. That's BEN sound.com. Janessa After Dark is written and directed by Chris M. Stoner and is a Champagne Dreams production.